Welcome to Friends of Europe's online Critical Thinking Live with Malaika Oringa. Today, we're going to be discussing women's empowerment, but it's a story from a different angle and different perspective. We want to ask the question about whether the current model of women's empowerment really reflects the diversity of women's experiences across the world and not just in the North and the West. Today, I have a great pleasure to welcome Malaika Oringa, someone who's a bit of a heroine. I know she's a real heroine, someone who has fought hard, struggled to make her own way through an experience of human trafficking and come out of that solidly and successfully insofar as she set up her own foundation, Footprints to Freedom, and is now being, vowed across the world with awards and other matters in terms of her bravery, her risk-taking, but also her voice. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you, Malaika. And this conversation, as I said, is about women's empowerment. And the first question I wanted to ask you is, do you feel the current narratives, the current models that we consume about women's empowerment, as in Europe, the West, the United States, elsewhere, does it reflect your experience? Do you see yourself reflected in that story of women's empowerment?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Looking at the model that is happening now, I think it's more top-down than bottom-up. As a migrant survivor of human trafficking, of course, we have a lot of limitation and barriers to kind of enter the ring of empowerment women. Of course, there are barriers that we face. Maybe I'll give you an example. Of course, for one to be empowered, to be part of the change, you need to have the right support that can kind of motivate you or build you up to have the right skills, the right mental state to be part of the change. When I look at my personal experience, when I was rescued, I showed the interests that I would want to be part of the change. I want to make sure that no other girl can go through the same experience like I did. However, the kind of environment or the structures that were in place, I wasn't fitting in because at that time I was undocumented, just like in many countries. The victimhood of survivors or victims is attached to getting the trafficker. If they do not get the trafficker, they withdraw kind of support, the help, the income, the right to go to school, the rights for housing, the right to everything. So when the investigation stopped, they kind of withdrew all the support that they needed. Sorry, they were supposed to give me. Well, that was already disempowering. There's nothing that empowering about removing the support the person needs to get empowered. So it took me a lot of courage, a lot of hard work for me to kind of come back to the ring. It took me 11 years to get my residence permit. You can imagine that there are some women who are not very resilient. Actually, I was clear to my calling that I want to be the voice of women who cannot speak themselves. I want to bring their voice to a stage that can be heard beyond churches, beyond community, to bring them to the parliament. But the criteria to reach that table was so hard. So coming back to your question, that how is the current empowerment engagement model? Is discriminatory. I think it's inconsistent. And also, it does not take into consideration that for not everyone who wants to be part of the ring should be equal, because they use the equality model. I think equity is the best model we can use, especially if you need to bring a diversity of experiences from a woman like me who has got PSTD, who has been homeless, who has been going through all this, and I need more than just one support to bring me at the table. So I think there should be more, not only top down, it's bottom up, kind of investing in the personal growth of women mentally, intellectually. There should be accessibility to education. I was kicked out of school my first week of school. And unfortunately, it was the most painful experience because I was trafficked because the trafficker promised to take me to school. I come to be rescued and I can't look forward to regain my life. After 2 years, they tell me you do not have a right to go to school because your permit has been suspended.
Mm.
This only does not leave women at the verge of being trafficked. The disempowerment leave them in kind of a position of being re-exploited, or also kind of missing the real voices. The quality of my input will not be as good as it is now because I've been supported, I've been given opportunities to be on discussion like this on tables where my views are considered to be impactful or making a difference.
Like you're saying some really important things about the model, if you can call it that, a universal model of women's empowerment, that from what you've just said doesn't recognize the choices that are not available to you, the kind of infrastructure that actually actively stops you from participating in wider society, and systems of discrimination and processes of how we relate to and make sense of individuals that come from traffic situations or domestic abuse, or just simply being as sex workers, or all forms of criminal human violence. Actually, that narrative doesn't really understand what it is to be you and many like you. So let's start with where does your story start? Because I think that will help us then come back to that question about how important we need to change the narrative around women's empowerment. So where does your story start?
Actually, before I go into the story, I forgot to mention something important, is the language. The language barrier is yet a very significant problem that hinder women to get kind of be part of the empowerment or to contribute. Because I think in the West or everywhere in the world, language is kind of is measured as a measure of intellectuality. I think they should find kind of a way between. I think in the United Nations conferences, people speak from different languages, but they are heard. But when people are coming from the minority background, it's kind of very difficult for them to voice because the language already blocks them from moving beyond their own language to be part of the national language. Answering your question, where did it start? How were, I call it the social economical situation kind of instigated me being be preyed upon by a trafficker. As we know, human trafficking does not happen in vacuum. It's an end result of a range of other persistent injustice, inequalities in our society, in our economy. And looking back at the environment at which I grew in, gender-based violence was just a norm. Like violation of women's rights was just normal, and there was no justice for women. And being a young girl growing up in this kind of structure, I can really now affirm that it was a breeding ground for me to become trafficked or become vulnerable to being trafficked even before the trafficker showed up. The whole setup of the environment, it was disempowering. Women had no voice. I grew up in an environment where my friends were married off at the age of 13, environment where a girl is forced to keep silent because of the rape, because it's going to bring shame to the family. An environment where women had no agency, where women had no right for their reproductive rights, women who didn't have right to education. So already the environment, the social setting, the culture that tolerated violence, or how can I call it, disempowerment of women, was my normal. So when the trafficker came in with a good gesture, it was, of course, it was too good to be true, but at least it was better than what was going on. Maybe I would like to share something personal. That is my family tree. Looking back at how we were raised, I was raised by a single mother. She was married off at the age of 13, and she got her first child at the age of 14. She never got a chance to go to school, and also she became a grandmom at the age of 26 with barely children she can take care of. So I realized that it came on to the second generation, where my siblings also got children at a young age and also got married at a young age. This time they looked at marriage as security, for food security, that, you know, if a woman, if you're married, then at least you have food to eat. So I presume that being in that kind of environment, how do I define myself as a young girl? How do I translate what is seen in the society to kind of see myself as a woman or a young girl in the society? So I believe that this society where we grew in as young girls already kind of instigate us to be victims of human trafficking before it even happens. There are some cultural practices I want to share. During part of my work, I work with a lot of survivors. I hear their stories, and I use this stage to I come as one, but I speak as 1,000, to kind of bring their voices on the table. In some countries, for example, Nigeria, a lot of girls are bonded into the juju oath. They find themselves bonded, and it's acceptable, like it's in the community, it's really acceptable for you to go through this bondage. But what I see that a lot of survivors of human trafficking have been affected by this juju oath, which kind of entails them to pay a certain amount of money to the trafficker. And I have a young, strong girl I know. She was bonded for 10 years. After paying off the debt in forced prostitution in Italy, the government does not recognize the bond, that the juju psychological bond that she never reported on time. And another one mentioned something that was very sad, but it's true, that in Botswana, they were selling her for ritual substitute, like being a wife to the god. And the best way was to find something better than that. And when the trafficker came along, I remember she said, I would do anything. I would be a prostitute. I would be anything besides being this. So the whole is of these cultural norms that are kind of normalized make us already broken, so frustrated and desperate to live. There's one thing that is I learned of recent in Uganda, that we have also a market where it's in Rapai district, where it's a weekly market where young girls and kids are sold just alongside other merchandise and the modern day slavery at a price of $14. And
And this
knowing
is
that
happening now. This
in
happening now.
now in Uganda.
Wow. Okay, sorry. Carry on.
Yes. I was so surprised. Of course, having been now in Europe for 17 years, I thought, well, yeah, slavery or exploitation of women and men and girls has been a bit elevated to maybe domestic servitude, or it's not done in plain sight. But I got to learn that this is a cultural or societal activity that has been going on for years. It's just that it was discovered or recent. You go to the markets, you want a girl, even if you want a baby, they just a variety. And you wonder which kind of society that are girls being raised in, where the selling of fellow sisters is kind of a norm, that you can go to the market and buy one and There's no accountability, and if actually the parents are the ones selling you. So, given this background, I have grown up in this kind of disempowering environment. I remember when I was approached by a trafficker at the age of 15. He was wearing a red cross, as that is a symbol of hope. And when he told me, you know what, you look like a brilliant girl, you want to go to school, I want to take you to a country where you will get a free education, it's safe, there's food security for you. And I think looking back at what was happening on around me, I thought this was the best possible solution. I did not even doubt it. It was too good to be true. But I was so desperate for an alternative that is better than what was going on. And it is equally happening to so many girls that end up in exploitation. As we know, human trafficking actually function on desperation. A lot of young girls and women are desperate. So when he gave me this offer, I ended up being sold into sex slavery and ended up having a huge debit to pay. I realized that when I was rescued, I was not even feeling the urge to pursue for justice because I didn't know that I was worth it. I wasn't raised to fight for my justice. I was just blaming myself for being naive, and also growing up knowing that there's no infrastructure or laws and system that support women, that you cannot go anywhere if you've been raped, or hearing that there's a person has been exploiting a young girl and he's been imprisoned. There's no accountability. It affected my statement when I was speaking about what happened to me. As I mentioned earlier, I was illegal for 11 years. And one of the reasons was that I wasn't identifying myself as a victim because the whole how I was raised to be, what happened to me was normal. Actually, I was happy that I'm alive.
Wow. I'm humbled. It's shocking, some of the things you've said. There is a tendency that actually people watching this might be feeling conscious and concerned that this is about voyeurism. But for me, the way you've expressed this is so powerful. I love what you've just said, that actually it's your one voice, but you're the voice of thousands. And the reality is what you've painted is a picture of a whole systemic approach to your consistent and coherent denial of life chances that boys and men get in any society, but it's more pronounced in the societies that you refer to. And I think many in the West or the North will feel uncomfortable with the truth of what you're speaking, especially because there is that sense that you're going to almost stereotype whole cultures and whole societies. And I think that that can be a real blockage to help people like you and others that have come through the system. So when I think about development aid, from the West or the North, when I think about strategies for women's empowerment that are funded, I wonder how many of them take account of the fact and have the braveness to say, this is about intergenerational norming. This is about how economic system operates that fundamentally, systematically excludes and disempowers women that start from your starting point. And actually, if you have no other role model or you have no references of empowerment,
we cannot be what we cannot see.
Perfectly said. So on that note, Malaika, let's move to, because you've actually changed things in the sense that you've used your experience, you have gone through this tragic journey of learning, but you've turned it on its head and made it into this foundation, this wonderful foundation, but you're also using your voice to get into those systems and places of power to make them think differently. So let's use this opportunity of our conversation to think about, if we were speaking to policymakers, I mean, the European Commission has just brought out its strategy on human, exploitation and human trafficking. We have a number of policies from the Commission they've launched over the years, past 5 years, on women's equality, for example. Use this platform to say and share your views about the importance of including you and your story and your voice.
Thank you for asking that. There's a big deficit in including lived experience. It doesn't only have to be human trafficking, but also gender-based violence. One thing that I've noticed is that survivors are met at the stage of their vulnerability. That people fail to understand that when a survivor is supported, they can be very instrumental in changing not only policies, but also services. So in order for us really to internalize the policies to be kind of reflective on what exactly victims and survivors need, we need to engage survivor in research, but also include them at the decision-making table when you're coming up with these policies, and ask questions. Where did the last policy fail you? What would have helped you? What gaps did you kind of encounter? Part of my work as a survivor chair at the Global Council of Salvation Army in their way of improving the response to human trafficking is to tap in those gaps that existed in the process of my journey to become a survivor leader. So coming back to the policies, survivor narrative is very, very significant because they know firsthand how traffickers kind of lure people into slavery. They know which tactics traffickers use to escape the law. But most importantly, they know exactly what is survivor-centered or what is trauma-informed. So without their narrative, you miss out the greatest ingredient that is serving the victims and the survivors in the way that is culture-informed, that is trauma-informed, and that is victim-centered. And also, not only that survivors should be brought to share their story, because I believe survivors are more than their story. I've been very, very vocal on that. I'm not defined by my past, but I'm defined with where I'm going. But what I see nowadays is that what is brought on the table are survivor vulnerable stories. They would be good because they kind of push and instigate action towards change, but it doesn't really send a message to other survivors around the world that you can be part of the process, you can be part of the embedded structure. And I think one of the biggest problems I see is that there are a lot of barriers to engage survivors. And this is because they have a lot of issues. They have PSTD. They are dealing with the internal issues that they have to first deal with. And sometimes it takes years. But without the policymakers kind of investing in the mental health of survivors to kind of make them ready to serve as equals on the table, they will always be dependent on the policies and depending on services. So also what I realized that there's need for diversity in inclusion, not only victims of sex trafficking, but there should be all types of trafficking experience on the table. Because when we're bringing all these experience together, we can come up with a robust solution that does not leave the other voices out. For example, what I see is that when they're implementing policies, there's a lack of minority or African survival of human trafficking experience on the table. But what they miss out is the systematic understanding what are the systematic causes that bound these women into slavery. There's also another example I can give. For years, we've been advocating that the time that traffickers serve in jail for trafficking women and girls, is short, like 3 to 4, 5 years is very short, or 7, compared to the lifelong traumatic experience that a survivor has to experience. Sometimes the traffickers come back after 5 years in jail, and you are still kind of not emotionally stable. And I've met a lot of women who kind of rebound back into trafficking experience because the trafficker became a trigger. So, like narrative like this on the table, discussing this, like taking the voice of survivors as serious as other academics. There's one thing about experience, it cannot be taught in school. You can have a PhD, but you cannot learn to be a lived experience. So I would suggest that if we want really to combat and hear different variety of experience, we need to not be discriminative. We need to include survivors from different races, from different surviving experience. At the same time, we need to give them the platform. We need to give them the agents. We need to have scholarships for them in place for them to have kind of the confidence, but also the knowledge they should have on human trafficking. There's also an issue of if you don't engage survivors, you will not understand the length at which people take to get empowered enough to participate. There's an issue where people think, okay, after five years, one should be okay. Well, the bad news is it's 17 years down the road after my rescue, but I still suffer with some of the aftermaths of my exploitation. And one thing I've learned that freedom does not end at rescue. It's an ongoing process. And that requires investing in the recovery, not 1 year, not 2 years, but at least to make sure that you walk and work with the survivors throughout the recovery point. And I want to emphasize this, that we can no longer claim to want freedom for others without including those ones with lived experience, or working alongside those ones with lived experience, or supporting them to lead along. Because freedom is only felt when you are part of it.
Excellent. Wow. Again, I'm so pleased that you have made the time to have this conversation with us, Malaika. There are some important points you're making which refer to not just the experience of trafficking, but about what you've described so brilliantly is the anatomy of exclusion and systematic discrimination of women across the world with different experiences, but it's an anatomy of the systematic exclusion and exploitation of women. And that point you make that policymakers, and this is my words, not yours, are almost complicit in the crime. And I know that's very controversial. They're complicit in the crime if they do not include you to understand if their policy actually makes a difference, and to understand from you where it fails and what the faults are and where it's being exploited. Because policymakers need to think differently about how they think about both empowerment, but also a lot of talk about empowerment of women in Africa in particular. But it feels that the story you're telling is little heard by policymakers, by both within Africa, but also within Europe and elsewhere. So there's an important point you're making. And I want to conclude by and it's very difficult to conclude a conversation like this, but going back to the beginning about women's empowerment, when you think about International Women's Day, I was thinking about International Women's Day as you were speaking, and this day that's celebrated, that everyone does things around, and you think, really? It feels symbolic, shambolic, and not really taking account of the kind of thing that, when you spoke about Uganda and elsewhere, We live in the 21st century where women are still being sold in the market or intergenerationally normed into not feeling they have power. Yet we have the kind of developments in technology and economics which are beyond belief. So what's your reflection by conclusion on International Women's Day?
I think International Women's Day should be very, what can I use? The last time I made a message about Happy Women's Day, I mentioned something that I want to share. That when we look at Women's Day at a higher, at a peak, we fail to see what is really happening on the ground. So in my celebration, I was celebrating those women whose name do not appear in Wikipedia or who do not have a PhD, but they struggle and they strive within their small community to voice their opinion, to kind of nature. My mom raising me, raising 10 children alone. For me, these are real women those are real heroes. When we're celebrating and giving the light on, of course, women have worked their way up, but we need to highlight the real issues. What does a hero looks like? Is that hero who is in the market, wakes up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go in the market to make sure that the children have something to eat? Heroes are those small voices that are not heard, but they stand up in the women's group to kind of voice the issues that impact them. But it's, how do you call it, where the bar is high for being a hero. And as I mentioned, we cannot reflect on what we do not see. If everyone, a woman hero has got a PhD, is a first lady, they're all they have flamboyant kind of ranks. What about a little Malaika who was somewhere in the village who wants to be this woman? I need contextual when it comes to Women's Day. So they should bring a more diversity. Women at the lower, the bottom, who are doing a lot of work, in equivalent to people who have worked their way up. And we have to be intentional. We have to be transparent and hit on the most things that are affecting women. We cannot celebrate women when 71% of the trafficked women in the world are women. We cannot celebrate women when still only 20% of women and girls go to school. We cannot celebrate women when we're still under poverty. It's not time to celebrate, it's time to advocate for change. So we need to find better campaign to voice these two together, bring the small voices on the table. Yeah, like what inclusivity, it doesn't really mean that you should have come from the West or have been a hero in the world. We need to recognize these small achievements. And these small achievements are going to be kind of a lesson, kind of something that others can identify with, that I can be her. She managed to, through her small business, and she managed to raise the children, or through these children from the mothers who are selling tomatoes. The girl is in the university, which it should be actually, maybe to make it more contextual, it should be more contextual. We should really relate to the term Women's Day. I should feel that is speaking to me, is speaking to Malala, is speaking to someone in Uganda, and speaking to a refugee, and is speaking to someone from Roma.
Brilliant. Malaika, thank you. Can I just say, it's been an honor and humbling, but most importantly, enabling us to bear witness to a story which is so powerful. There shouldn't be anyone who watches this and listens to this that feels that sense of, victimhood. This is about a powerful woman, and other powerful women that you are reflecting through this conversation. And as I said again, you have chosen this platform to talk to us at Friends of Europe, but you've given the voice to thousands and hundreds of thousands of women across the world, which for that, I thank you deeply for doing that. But I also would like to say, you've given a salutary lesson to many about when they think about International Women's Day. I hope they listen and remember what you've just said, but to also policymakers that are trying to do their best, or say they're trying to do the best in trying to change women's economic empowerment. And you've given us some very powerful lessons about the fact that women's economic empowerment has to be contextualized in some of the stories that you've told. And actually, what you've shared with us is the equivalent of a PhD from Oxford. In true sense, in terms of where people listen to academics, but experience is the guts of life. And I think it's important that policymakers think long and hard about how they share power in policymaking if they're going to reach the benefits and have the impact on people like you. Malaika, thank you very much for being with us. It's been a sheer joy and a pleasure. And you've opened our eyes, but I'm hopefully the eyes of many that watch this Critical Thinking Live with you. Thank you again. You take care. And all I can say is to our viewers, this will make you feel, I hope, a sense of pause and reflection. You'll need to have a cup of coffee or something stronger afterwards, just to reflect on what you've heard and the changes, the small changes all of us can make in our conversation, our advocacy, and our commentary around women's economic empowerment and women's empowerment, because actually we take too much for granted and are based on received wisdom of what it means. So thanks to you, Malaika, for enabling us to have that reflection. Look, keep an eye on our website for our next events, obviously. And the theme of women and women's empowerment and women's equity is a key priority for Friends of Europe, and we will continue to have these kind of conversations and reach out and find people like you, Malaika, all over the world, so we can continue this conversation. Thank you very much, everybody. Keep safe and mind your distance, and thank you very much, Malaika. Take care.